Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, June 15th. We begin our cast with a look at Canada's housing market, which continues to balance out following skyrocketing prices. The Canadian Real Estate Association says the housing market saw a slowdown to more normal levels of sales activity last month and a flattening out of prices. It says sales were down 9% from April and 22% from the same month last year. This is a decline that economists attribute mainly to rising interest rates. According to the CREA, sales in May resembled levels of activity seen in the second half of 2019 before the pandemic began. The average seasonally adjusted price in May sat at about $700,000, which is down nearly 4% from April. Turning to Toronto now, where the interim police chief is apologizing to the city's Black community after the release of previously unseen race-focused data. Newly released statistics show Black people faced a disproportionate amount of police enforcement and use of force in 2020. Black people were also more likely to have an officer point a gun at them, whether perceived as armed or unarmed, than white people in the same situation. Interim Police Chief James Raymer says the force needs to do better. Meanwhile, a federal court-appointed company has dropped the ball for a third time when it comes to privacy breaches. The latest incident is in relation to the $900 million settlement deal that Ottawa agreed to with military members who experienced sexual misconduct while in uniform. Epic Class Action Services Canada has again sent a sensitive and personal email to a different claimant. The veteran asked not to be identified because she still works for the federal government. And she said the information was contained in an attachment as she was fighting Epic after the company sent her settlement check to the wrong address. All right, moving to Alberta now, where Legal Aid says family violence is a growing problem in the province. The organization says the number of emergency protection orders filed by the agency has risen 17% since 2018. Lawyer Christina Riddoch says advocates are calling the trend the shadow pandemic. She says COVID-19 lockdowns isolated victims of abuse, and job losses and financial strain put families under pressure, leading to more cases of family violence. Ms. Riddoch says rising inflation and higher costs of living are also driving the problem. In northern Manitoba, a First Nation has declared a local state of emergency over its lack of supplies and services. York Factory, located some 850 kilometers north of Winnipeg, made the declaration in a letter to the provincial government. It says the band has absorbed significant expenses to maintain food, equipment, and social services. This is due to the delays in the startup of its summer ferry schedule. The community has been without ground access since April 26th. On the West Coast, city officials in Kelowna, BC, have also declared a local state of emergency in response to isolated flooding. The latest threat from rising water levels have been boosted by more than expected rainfall in the nearby mountains and valley, which in turn has swollen creeks and streams. All right, staying in BC, where a long-awaited report on money laundering has been released. It says members of the former British Columbia Liberal government knew hundreds of millions of dollars in suspicious money was circulated at Vancouver area casinos, but it didn't do enough to prevent the crime. The inquiry report was by former BC Supreme Court Justice Austin Cullen, and it says there is no evidence of political or personal corruption, but it also says the actions taken by the former government were not enough to stop the flow of illegal cash in the province. The report makes 101 recommendations. All right, moving to a new study published today in the American Journal of Psychiatry. It shows it's possible to offer a more flexible treatment at home to patients struggling with opioid addiction without reducing the chance of success. The new treatment was developed in a clinical trial through the Canadian Research Initiative in Substance Misuse, and it's based on prescribing a drug known as Suboxone. Researchers recommend that after the first 2 weeks, patients could continue the treatment unsupervised at home. The Public Health Agency of Canada reports more than 5,300 Canadians died from opioid overdoses between January and September of 2021. This amounts to around 20 deaths per day. On the East Coast, a plane carrying 177 Ukrainian refugees touched down in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador on Tuesday night. It was the second airlift chartered by the Newfoundland and Labrador government to bring Ukrainians fleeing Russian attacks to Canada's easternmost province. The first arrived on May 9th, carrying 166 passengers. Stay with us. We'll have a look at monkeypox up next in our weekly medical segment. We'll be right back. Public health officials in Montreal say the city is the epicenter of the monkeypox outbreak in North America. Montreal is offering a vaccine to all men who have sex with men, including sex workers and those who are visiting the city. Quebec Interim Public Health Director Dr. Luc Boileau says there are 132 confirmed cases of the disease in Quebec, with the vast majority of those cases in Montreal. Officials say 3 people have been hospitalized since the beginning of the outbreak, but all of them have been discharged. Well, joining us now to give us our weekly medical segment is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Appletree Medical Group. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Pleasure to be here.
So how many cases of monkeypox have been reported in the rest of Canada so far compared to Montreal?
Right. So as of June 10th, Canada had a total of 112 confirmed cases. We had 1 in British Columbia, 4 in Alberta, 9 cases in Ontario, and 98 cases in Quebec. Since then, so just 5 days ago, Quebec has now seen a 34% increase in cases to 132. Of those 132 cases, 126 cases were detected in Montreal. So that represents essentially an 8% of the entire world's cases of monkeypox.
And we mentioned that Montreal is the epicenter of the monkeypox outbreak in all of North America. So should Canadians be concerned, Dr. Raut?
Well, I think the arrival of summer means we're going to have a lot of tourists flocking to Montreal as well in the coming months. I think both the city and the province do want to get a handle on the situation as soon as possible. We've seen already Quebec announcing a vaccination campaign targeting those most at risk. Overall, as Dr. Butler says, there's one group in particular that's being affected, which is men who are having sexual relations with other men. And so what they are saying with this group is that they're likely seeing these cases because there has been always positive health-seeking behavior in this demographic. So overall, what we would say is looking at these groups here, we're not seeing huge change of transmission outside those groups at this point. So from a safety perspective, I don't think we need to be too worried here.
All right. And as you mentioned, a lot of people are interested in traveling to Montreal for tourism. So what can tourists do to be extra safe if they're traveling to Montreal this summer?
Right. I think we've learned a lot of lessons from COVID-19 with this, washing our hands very frequently, avoiding contact with infected individuals, wearing a face mask, avoiding wildlife because there is that concern with monkeypox there. And finally, getting vaccinated if you are part of the group that's most at risk as well. We know that vaccination has been stepping up in these communities as well in Quebec and Montreal, and we think it's going to be very helpful in that vein.
So do you think people should consider maybe not traveling to Montreal during the summer season this year?
Well, so what we've seen so far is 126 cases in the metropolitan area of Montreal, which has a population of 4.2 million people. So I think from a statistical perspective, I don't think we need to worry too much about not traveling to Montreal quite yet. However, if we start seeing the cases double, quadruple, and then take on an exponential level, then of course that's a different story.
And you mentioned a little earlier the targeted vaccination campaigns in Montreal and other cities. Should officials consider mass vaccination against monkeypox in Canada?
I think that's an excellent question. Should we be looking really at mass vaccination rather than targeted immunization? So far, experts agree that targeted is the way to go. You want to do targeted immunization if you, 1, have a high level of cases in a certain group, and 2, you don't and probably won't have the vaccines to even consider mass vaccination for a long period of time. So based on limited resources that we would have with our own smallpox vaccines, I would expect that we will focus primarily on targeted vaccination campaigns.
All right, and on the topic of vaccinations, we know that the WHO's technical lead for monkeypox mentioned that most data on smallpox vaccinations is old. So what else is still what else do we still need to learn about monkeypox vaccinations, Dr. Raut?
Yeah, I think there's a lot we need to learn about monkeypox in general. A lot of the data has been quite old there. As a physician, I'm always concerned about the effects of a new disease on vulnerable groups. We want to look at children, pregnant women as well. And of course, with vaccines, we don't actually have a monkeypox vaccine. We're relying on smallpox vaccines to provide that immunity. So a lot more to learn in that domain.
All right, Dr. Raut, Medical Director at Appletree Medical Group. Always great having you on Forum Daily, sir. Thanks again, and we'll see you again next week.
Thanks so much for having me.
Stay with us. We've got lots more coming up after the break. We'll be examining current relations between China and Australia after the first minister-to-minister talks in over 2 years that took place following the election of a new Australian government. We'll be speaking with Cleo Paskal, an Indo-Pacific expert and non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Defence of Democracies. And we'll be discussing the recent diplomatic tours of Pacific Island countries by both Australia and China, along with their impact. So stay tuned. We'll be right back with a great interview. Earlier this week, China's ambassador to Australia said relations between the two countries are at a new juncture. This with the election of a new Australian government and the first minister-to-minister talks in more than 2 years. Ambassador Xiao Qian gave an upbeat assessment of their relationship potential in a speech on Saturday. And on Sunday, China's defense minister held an hour-long meeting with his Australian counterpart on the sidelines of a regional security summit in Singapore. Now, despite these steps, observers are wary of describing the meeting as a thawing of a diplomatic deep freeze between the two countries. Well, joining us now to discuss the significance of this is Ms. Cleo Paskal, Indo-Pacific expert and non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Defence of Democracies. Ma'am, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, China and Australia recently engaged in Pacific Island hopping tours in the region. So what are both sides looking to gain here?
So in the case of China, it was a big trip by Wang Yi, who's their foreign minister, and he went physically to 8 Pacific Island countries. So the map you had up before with the red band, those were the exclusive economic zones in the countries that he visited. And if you look at that map, you can see that, if they maintain or get stronger relations with those countries, they've created a band that makes it possible to interdict Australia and New Zealand in the case of conflict. If they have their fishing fleets, their maritime militia, and some naval installations in those locations, even if it's just under the guise of humanitarian assistance and disaster response, they can make it very difficult for the Australians. And the Australians are, for their part, trying to, I think, regain some of what they think should be their rightful place in the region. Whether the Pacific Islanders feel that they have a rightful place there or not is what's being decided currently.
And to that point, you mentioned in an article on in the Sunday Guardian that China is engaged in entropic warfare in the region. So can you tell us a little bit more about this entropic warfare?
Right. So the word entropy, or in this context, entropic warfare, means fragmentation, disintegration, the creation of a state of chaos. And what China seems to try to do in target countries is dissolve, destroy, weaken the social and economic and political fabrics of the country so that it's easier for their influence operations to be effective. So that might be through social media operations, through taking over key sectors, through disrupting supply chains. This might all sound very familiar to people in North America because we've also been the target of some of these entropic warfare operations. And in the case of the Pacific Islands, they took a country like the Solomon Islands, which was relatively stable 2 years ago when it was in recognition of Taiwan. It flipped to China. And within those 2 years, they created a state of such internal chaos that there were riots there. And that justified the authoritarian government bringing in PLA police trainers. So it can happen very quickly, creating a state of chaos that justifies an authoritarian government to become even closer to Beijing and bring in military, if not police, to help put down political dissent.
And what do we know so far about the moves made by Australia's newly elected government?
So we're all watching quite closely. The language is kind of interesting. They say they want to step up and they're blaming a lot on previous administrations. But China's toehold in the region was a bipartisan success. It took 2 decades of every political party in Australia not handling this well for China to get such a strong toehold. So the situation won't be remedied, if that's the desire coming out of Canberra, quickly. And hopefully what they say they want to happen, which is to create a situation that's more prosperous and stable and secure for the people of the Pacific, actually does happen. But it needs to be watched very closely. And for our viewers here in Canada, what's at stake in this dispute? So this is the front line between Asia and the Americas. You know, these islands, Solomon Islands, is the location of the Battle of Guadalcanal. It'll be the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Guadalcanal this summer. These are highly strategic locations. If it comes to conflict over Taiwan, for example, we know that China is looking to secure its position in the Pacific Islands to be able to have a buffer so that allies can't get to Taiwan in order to be able to help the people of Taiwan remain democratic and free. So it's a very strategically important location that affects the balance of power across the Indo-Pacific and the success and ability of democracies to sustain themselves. All right, Ms. Cleo Paskal from FDD, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily. Thank you for having me. Up next, we've got more news from around the world, of course. The European Central Bank vows to create a new unspecified market backstop. Russia once again cuts natural gas exports through a key European pipeline. Egypt, Israel, and the EU have signed a deal involving liquefied natural gas sales, and automakers reported nearly 400 crashes with semi-automated vehicles. We'll have these stories and more news from around the world coming up next. Stay with us. The U.S. Federal Reserve intensified its drive to tame high inflation by raising its key interest rate by 0.75 of a point. This is its largest hike in nearly 3 decades, and it's signaling more large rate increases to come that would raise the risk of another recession. The Fed is ramping up its drive to tighten credit and slow growth, with inflation having reached a 4-decade high of 8.6%, spreading to more areas of the U.S. economy and showing no sign of slowing. Meanwhile, the European Central Bank has vowed to come up with a new unspecified market backstop. It could be used to buffer some countries against bond market turmoil, which is similar to what shook the 19-country Eurozone during a debt crisis more than a decade ago. The statement came after an unscheduled meeting of the bank's governing council Wednesday. It aims to address a sell-off in Italian and Spanish government debt. This comes in the wake of the bank's decision to start raising interest rates in July for the first time in 11 years. Turning to China now, where factory output rebounded in May. This adds to a recovery from the latest economic slump induced by COVID-19 curbs. Government data shows industrial production rose 0.7% over a year earlier, recovering from April's 2.9% contraction. Consumer spending edged up compared with April, but was lower than a year ago. The anti-COVID measures have mostly been eased across China, but economic activity is expected to need weeks to recover. Russia's Gazprom has announced a reduction in natural gas flows through a key European pipeline for the second day in a row. The move Wednesday came just hours after Germany's vice chancellor said Russia's initial gas reduction appeared to be political rather than a result of technical problems. The state-owned energy giant Gazprom said on Twitter that gas deliveries through the Nord Stream 1 undersea pipeline to Germany would be cut again on Thursday. This brings the overall reduction in deliveries through the pipeline to 60%. One energy expert says Russia is playing a very deliberate strategy to drive up gas prices in the short term and to remind big energy importers like Germany and Italy what they have to lose in the long term. All of this comes as Egypt, Israel, and the European Union have signed a deal to increase liquefied natural gas sales to EU countries. These countries are aiming to reduce their dependence on supplies from Russia as the war in Ukraine drags on. The deal, stamped on Wednesday, will see Israel send more gas via Egypt, which has facilities to liquefy it for export by sea. That's according to European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen. Last year, the European Union imported roughly 40% of its gas from Russia. U.S. President Joe Biden is also looking to increase gas supplies. He wants U.S. oil refiners to produce more gasoline and diesel.
Mr. Biden says oil refiner profits have tripled during a time of war between Russia and Ukraine as Americans struggle with record high prices. Gas prices in the U.S. average roughly $5 a gallon. This is an economic burden for many Americans and a political threat for Biden's fellow Democrats before midterm elections. Turning our eyes to eastern Congo, where a spokesman for a top military official said Wednesday that if Rwanda wants war, it will have war. The comments by General Sylvain Ekenge came as thousands of protesters took to the streets of Goma to accuse Rwanda and Uganda of aggression. The escalating tensions come after the M23 rebel movement seized Bunagana, a key town in eastern Congo, on Monday. Rwanda and Uganda have both long denied supporting the Congolese rebel group. Automakers reported nearly 400 crashes of vehicles with partially automated driver assist systems. This includes 273 involving Teslas. This is according to new statistics from U.S. safety regulators. But the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration cautioned on Wednesday against using the numbers to compare automakers. It said it didn't weigh them by the number of vehicles from each manufacturer that used the systems or how many miles those vehicles traveled. Automakers reported crashes from July of last year through May 15th. This under an order from the agency, which is examining such crashes broadly for the first time. BC doctor turned writer Tolu Olurantoba has been named the Canadian winner of this year's Griffin Poetry Prize. Mr. Olurantoba received the $65,000 honor at an online ceremony on Wednesday. This for his debut collection, The Junta of Happenstance, published by Anne Struther Books. The international prize, also worth $65,000, went to St. Paul, Minnesota-based wordsmith Douglas Kearney's work Show from Wave Books. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily.